They said the baby didn't deserve a name, just a number in a lab, until the janitor stole her back and vanished. It was on a storm-slicked night in the forgotten town of Apple Hollow, Kentucky, when Maggie Turner first heard the cry that would change her life. She was mopping the dim hallway outside room 207 of the county hospital, her back aching, her heart quietly resigned to the loneliness that had settled in since her husband passed. The world had long stopped noticing Maggie, just another widow with a mop and no family to come home to. But through the thin hospital walls, she heard a young woman sobbing, raw, frightened, begging someone not to take her baby. Maggie paused, gripping the handle of her mop, as though it could anchor her to something real. Inside the room, a girl no older than 19 clutched her swollen belly, while a man in a dark suit calmly placed papers in front of her. "It's for the best," he said, voice like ice. But Maggie saw something else, the desperation in the girl's eyes, the terror of being erased. And in that moment, Maggie didn't just witness injustice. She became part of it. Maggie Turner had long since learned how to make herself small in a world that rarely looked twice. She moved through the hospital halls like a shadow, quiet, methodical, invisible. At 61, with salt-streaked hair always pulled into a loose bun and hands calloused from years of work, Maggie lived her life in quiet rhythm, mop, rinse, repeat. Her shift began at 6:00 p.m. sharp, just as the sun ducked behind the low Kentucky hills, and ended around midnight when the hospital finally hushed into stillness. She didn't mind the night. It was easier not to be noticed when the world was asleep. Since her husband died of a stroke 5 years ago, Maggie had lived alone in a one-bedroom clapboard house on the edge of Apple Hollow, a town so small it didn't have a traffic light or a gas station that stayed open past 8. Her days were filled with silence and small acts of care, feeding the stray cats behind the diner, sewing patches onto her old flannel shirts, rereading her late husband's dog-eared paperback novels. But in the fluorescent-lit corridors of the county hospital, Maggie had purpose. She cleaned the floors like they were her own kitchen tiles. She emptied the trash as if each bag held someone's pain she could carry away. No one asked her for much. The nurses barely looked up from their screens when she passed. The doctors, mostly young, distracted, too busy, rarely knew her name. But Maggie knew theirs. She memorized the rhythm of their shoes the way Nurse Patty hummed, when nervous, the soft sigh of Dr. Levin after losing a patient. She noticed everything even when no one noticed her. And that's why on the third Thursday of October, when a new sound pierced the usual shuffle of bedpans and whispered charts, a sharp, panicked cry behind a closed door, Maggie stopped. She didn't mean to eavesdrop. But something in that cry, something raw and broken, made her fingers tighten on her mop handle. She listened closer. And without fully knowing why, she stepped toward room 207. The hallway outside room 207 had always been quiet, reserved for recovery patients, end-of-life care, and the occasional administrative overflow. But tonight something cracked through the silence like lightning splitting a tree. Maggie paused mid-mop, her heart giving a strange flutter as a choked sob echoed through the closed door. It wasn't just sadness, it was panic betrayal, the kind of grief too big for one person to carry. She edged closer, her rubber-soled shoes making no sound on the waxed linoleum. From behind the door, a girl's voice trembled. "Please, I didn't agree to this. I just wanted help. Not this." Then a man, calm, cold, replied, "Emily, you signed the consent forms. It's standard protocol. You're giving your child a future far beyond what you could offer." Maggie's breath caught. She'd heard those words before, different voices, different faces, but always the same emptiness behind them. A soft rustle, a sniffle, then a desperate cry. No, I didn't know. I didn't know what it meant. Maggie reached for the doorknob instinctively, but stopped short, pressing her ear just close enough to hear the woman again, young, too young from the sound of her voice. "She's mine. Please don't take her. I want to hold her. Just once." The man whose voice she now recognized as one of the new administrators, Richard Hale, sighed as though he were tired of rehearsing the same play. You were 17 when you enrolled in the program. You signed off parental rights in exchange for prenatal care and housing. You knew what this was. Another silence. Maggie imagined the girl's hands shaking her belly round her hope, shrinking like air sucked from a room. And then the words that shattered Maggie's stillness. She won't even have a name, will she? Richard's answer came like frost. Names aren't necessary for subjects. Numbers are cleaner. Maggie backed away slowly, her stomach twisting, her eyes burning. Something was very, very wrong inside room 207. And for the first time in years, Maggie felt something stir in her chest. Not fear, not pity, something fiercer. A resolve. Inside room 207, the fluorescent lights cast a sterile glow over the trembling girl on the bed. Emily Dawson, barely 19 and visibly exhausted, clutched her hospital gown over her belly, her eyes swollen from hours of crying. Richard Hale stood at the foot of the bed, crisp in his tailored charcoal suit, his expression carefully neutral, too calm for a man discussing the fate of a newborn. He adjusted his silver cufflinks before speaking, his voice as smooth and measured as a news anchor. Emily, I understand you're upset, but this isn't about punishment or cruelty. It's about science and the greater good. She blinked at him. Confused lips parted. He continued, almost as if lecturing a child. Your baby has a rare genetic mutation, one we haven't seen in over 20 years. Her neural development is unlike anything recorded in live births. That makes her extraordinary, not in a way that makes traditional life possible, unfortunately, but in a way that makes her vital to medical advancement. Emily's mouth quivered. You're saying she's broken? Richard's eyes flicked toward her, but didn't soften. I'm saying she's special. And because she is, we can't waste her potential on sentiment. Hale Biogenics exists to help humanity evolve past its limitations. We offered you shelter, prenatal care, and discretion in exchange for access to cases like this. You agreed. Emily shook her head violently, her tangled hair sticking to her damp cheeks. I didn't know she'd be treated like a lab rat. Richard didn't flinch. She will be cared for, monitored, studied with the utmost precision. But a child like this, born with a delta 9 cranial shift and dual lobe fusion, she cannot survive in the world as it is. She was never meant for a crib or a kindergarten. She was meant for research. That's her purpose. Emily let out a scream, raw, maternal animal. But Richard remained unmoved. He pulled out the clipboard, tapped the pen, and said quietly, We need your final signature now. Time is critical. What he didn't see, what none of them did, was the janitor's shadow in the hallway, still listening, fists clenched. Maggie Turner had heard enough. Maggie didn't remember pushing the door open. It happened between heartbeats, somewhere between Richard Hale's clinical voice and the sound of a girl breaking. One moment she was gripping the mop handle in the hallway. The next she was inside. Room 207, standing between a predator in a suit and a girl who looked like she might shatter. Richard turned startled, but Maggie didn't look at him. She went straight to Emily, whose face was buried in trembling hands, shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Maggie crouched down slowly, her knees aching from years of scrubbing floors, and reached out her hand, not with authority, not with pity, just presence. Her fingers brushed against Emily's. The girl flinched at first, as if expecting to be hurt again, but Maggie didn't pull back. She simply let her hand rest there, warm and steady. After a moment, Emily lifted her tear-streaked face and their eyes met. Something passed between them, ancient, maternal, wordless. Maggie had no child of her own, not anymore. She had buried that pain deep in boxes sealed tight and shoved into the corners of memory. But now it came flooding back, not as sorrow, but as strength. Emily's hand, small and cold, closed around hers like a lifeline. Maggie squeezed gently. You don't have to sign anything, she said, her voice quiet but firm, like steel wrapped in velvet. Richard took a step forward, mouth open to object, but Maggie stood up slowly, squaring her shoulders in a way she hadn't in years. You'll leave this room now, she said without looking at him. You've said enough. And though he bristled, though his badge carried power and money, there was something in Maggie's gaze that made him pause. Emily looked up at the older woman, her body still weak, but her spirit no longer alone. That single act, one hand reaching for another, changed the trajectory of two lives. In the stillness that followed, something was born that no file, no contract, no corporation could quantify trust. The hospital room was dim now, the overhead lights replaced by the softer hum of a lamp in the corner, casting a golden glow over the sterile walls. Maggie stood by Emily's side, wiping the young girl's forehead with a cool cloth, whispering words of comfort she barely remembered knowing. The girl's contractions had grown stronger, more painful, the room filling with the quiet tension of impending life. No doctor had come, no official team, no monitors or machines, just Maggie and a single nurse who didn't ask too many questions. The rest of the staff had been told this was a routine case flagged under research observation, but Maggie made sure no clipboard-holding stranger stepped through that door again. Emily's fingers dug into Maggie's hand as another wave hit her. Breath-ragged tears streaming down her face, not from pain alone, but fear, the weight of not knowing if she'd ever hold the child growing inside her. "You're almost there." Honey, Maggie whispered, her voice thick. "You're not alone." And then, after one final push and a cry that sounded like it tore through generations of women before her, the room fell silent. For a moment. Then a sound pierced the air, not a cry of distress, but a high, delicate wail, the sound of new lungs meeting the world. The nurse lifted the tiny, slick body and placed her gently onto Emily's chest. "It's a girl," she said softly. Emily's arms, trembling, folded around the infant. She looked down at the child through a veil of exhaustion and awe. "Lila," she breathed. "Lila Grace." Her voice cracked on the second word like it held a secret only the two of them shared. Maggie stood, frozen hand to her chest, watching as the girl who had been discarded, manipulated, and silenced became a mother with nothing but love in her eyes. And then, as quickly as it had come, the light in Emily's gaze faded. Her eyes fluttered closed. Her head fell back against the pillow. The heart monitor flickered. The nurse moved fast, calling out for help, but Maggie knew. Emily had given all she had left. Lila Grace was here, and she was alone, except for Maggie. Maggie sat motionless beside the incubator, her hand pressed lightly against the plastic as the newborn inside slept, unaware of the storm surrounding her first hours of life. Lila Grace, barely the size of a loaf of bread, lay swaddled in a hospital-issued blanket, her tiny fingers twitching her breaths, shallow but steady. Outside the nursery, nurses moved briskly, papers shuffled, and murmurs of protocol filled the air, but inside that quiet room, time stood still. Emily remained unconscious in the ICU, pale and still, her body exhausted from the trauma of birth and the emotional onslaught that came before. The doctors said she needed time, hours, maybe days to recover, but no one knew if she would wake up. Maggie had not left the hospital. She slept upright in a vinyl chair, clutching her late husband's jacket around her shoulders, refusing to go home, refusing to let Lila be left alone. But now, a social worker had been called, and Maggie knew what came next. Paperwork, protocol, transfer, custody. And if Hale Biogenics still had any claws sunk into this hospital, they would come back for the baby with legal muscle and scientific jargon and take her far away from any chance at a normal life. So Maggie did what she hadn't done in decades. She stood up and asked for something. She walked into the administrator's office, voice shaking, but determined, and requested temporary custody, not permanent. Just enough to keep Lila safe until Emily woke up. She showed her ID, her hospital badge, her spotless employment record. She didn't mention her empty house or the room that still held a crib from long ago. She just said the baby needed someone, and right now there was no one else. After hours of waiting, of phone calls and signatures and raised eyebrows, she was handed a lanyard with a green sticker that read, "Authorized Guardian. Temporary." Maggie took it with trembling hands, walked back to the nursery, and whispered through the glass, "I've got you now, little one. No one's taking you anywhere." While Maggie rocked the newborn against her chest in the quiet corner of the nursery, unaware of the quiet war unfolding behind the scenes, Richard Hale was already several steps ahead. He stood in the executive wing of the hospital behind a frosted glass door marked Private Research Division, flanked by two men in suits who spoke only when spoken to. On the table in front of him lay a single form, pre-filled and stamped with the Hale Biogenics seal. In the space once marked infant name where Emily Dawson had whispered Lila Grace with her last breath of strength, Richard took a pen and carefully crossed it out. In neat block letters he wrote, Subject 74, BG12. The initials he decided would stand for Biogenic Group, and the number was simply sequential, the latest in a quiet string of acquisitions the world would never hear about. To the public, Hale Biogenics was a medical research titan pioneering genetic treatments, miracle therapies, and life-saving biotechnologies. But deep inside its archives, a separate operation existed. One that required subjects born under very specific conditions, children with rare genetic markers that made them valuable not as people, but as data. Lila Grace, with her unknown paternity, rapid cell regeneration markers, and undocumented maternal history, fit their criteria too perfectly. Richard didn't care about the girl's health or future. He saw metrics, blood charts, anomaly curves. He submitted a transfer request masked as a special care reassignment, bypassed local oversight, and scheduled a private transport from the hospital to the Hale Biogenics campus 3 towns over. No one would ask questions. On paper, the baby no longer existed as a person, just a specimen under medical guardianship. The mother is comatose. The janitor has no legal claim, he muttered as he initialed the bottom of the file. By Monday, she's ours. He turned to his assistant. Prep the chamber, notify Dr. Kellerman, and scrub the name Lila from all records. I want nothing traceable. As far as Richard Hale was concerned, the baby was no longer a child. She was property. Maggie Turner sat in the dim nursery, rocking gently with the infant pressed to her chest, her arms forming a fragile shield between the child and the world. Outside machines beeped rhythmically, and fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, but inside her heart there was only one sound, the soft, helpless breath of the baby girl who had no one left. Emily still hadn't woken, and no family had come forward. Nurses whispered about transferring the baby. The social worker who'd reluctantly granted temporary guardianship had started asking about foster placement just in case. Maggie knew what that meant. Lila Grace, or the baby formerly known as Lila, was slipping through the cracks, and soon she'd disappear into a system that didn't see her as a person, and Maggie had been silent long enough. She stared down at the baby's impossibly tiny face, the faintest trace of a dimple curling in her cheek, and for the first time in years, something inside her cracked open, not with grief, but with fierce, defiant love. This child had no name on paper, no parents who could fight for her, and people like Richard Hale were already circling like vultures. Maggie had scrubbed those labs. She knew what it meant when a baby got assigned a code. She remembered the locked doors, the staff who couldn't speak, the rooms that smelled too clean and too cold to be for healing. Her voice when it came was low but firm, and it startled even herself. If no one's coming for her, then she's mine. It wasn't said with ceremony or drama. It was a statement simple and irrevocable. She would raise her, protect her, give her a name that could never be deleted, a story that couldn't be erased. She stood up, swaddled the baby tight, and walked straight past the nurse's desk with her head held high. The world could try to take this child, rename her, hide her. But Maggie Turner, widow janitor, nobody had just made the most powerful decision of her life. She would become somebody's mother again. The house Maggie lived in was small, set at the edge of a forgotten Kentucky town where the grass grew wild and the mail never came on time. But inside that house bloomed a kind of quiet magic. It wasn't filled with noise or toys with flashing lights. No bright plastic cluttered the floor. No cartoons blared from a television, because Maggie didn't believe in chaos raising children. Instead, her living room was lined with well-worn shelves of books, fairy tales, encyclopedias, poetry, nature guides. And in the corner sat a rocking chair with a quilt draped over the back, where every morning began and every evening ended. Lila Grace grew up in this hush, this rhythm of stillness and story. When she was just a baby, Maggie would hum low Appalachian lullabies while stitching fabric with calloused fingers, making cloth dolls out of Maggie's old blouses, soft yarn for hair, little stitched eyes that always smiled. Lila never cried much. She didn't need to. Maggie was always close, and in her presence, silence was never lonely. As Lila began to crawl, books were her playground. Maggie would sit cross-legged on the floor, letting the toddler tumble over picture books and trace letters with curious fingers. When Lila began speaking, it was slow and deliberate, like she had been thinking carefully about every word before letting it out. "Maggie," she said one day, "not Mom, not Mama, just Maggie," because that was the name of the woman who had given her everything, without ever asking for anything in return. Maggie smiled and nodded. "That's me." She never corrected her. Love didn't need a title. Each evening Maggie would light one oil lamp and they'd sit by it. Lila curled under her arm, listening to poems or stories read aloud in Maggie's soft drawl. On weekends, they'd walk to the edge of the woods behind the house, Lila collecting rocks and pressing leaves into blank books Maggie gave her, which over time became a kind of nature journal. The child filled with her own sense of wonder. The world outside remained fast, hard, and often cruel, but inside their little house time moved like honey, slow and golden. Maggie taught Lila that quiet was not absence, but presence, deep, attentive, sacred. In a world that had once erased her name, Lila Grace was being raised to believe in her own voice, even if she only whispered. From the time she was 3, it was clear that Lila Grace was unlike any child Maggie or the town had ever known. She didn't speak much, but when she did, her words were careful, precise, and startlingly observant. One day, as Maggie stitched a patch onto an old curtain, Lila looked up from the book she was flipping through and said, "The pattern repeats every 13 stitches." Maggie blinked, counted, and sure enough, Lila was right. She had never been taught to count beyond 10. At first, Maggie chalked it up to simple curiosity, but soon Lila began demonstrating skills that no toddler should have possessed. She could solve puzzles Maggie didn't even remember buying. She memorized entire pages of books after reading them once. She started organizing the spice jars by molecular compound instead of name-drawing complex geometric patterns with sidewalk chalk in the backyard, and asking questions about electricity and the nervous system with the calm clarity of a child born to understand what others simply learned. But there was another side to it all. For every moment of brilliance there came moments of terrifying fragility. Lila would collapse without warning, her body suddenly feverish, her pulse erratic. Her immune system was unpredictable. A common cold could leave her bedridden for days. Doctors, when Maggie could afford the visit, were baffled. They ran tests, shook their heads, and mumbled things like rare anomaly or unclassifiable genetic expression. But Maggie already knew the truth because she had never forgotten that night in the hospital, when the man from Hale Biogenics said Lila wasn't meant for love-only study. Maggie knew that her little girl carried something inside her, some delicate thread of DNA so rare and powerful it frightened the people who first discovered it. But she also knew that what Lila needed wasn't a lab or a label. She needed someone to stay, to choose her again and again, even when her body faltered and the world didn't understand. So Maggie learned to read Lila's skin for signs of a fever before it came. She learned how to brew elderflower tea, when to dim the lights, how to carry her upstairs without waking her. They lived quietly, without insurance, without questions. And Maggie made a promise every time Lila's breathing slowed in sleep that no one, not Richard Hale, not Hale Biogenics, not the world would ever take this child away, while Maggie still had breath in her lungs. It was a rainy Thursday afternoon when Maggie Turner first noticed it, just a flicker of doubt, the kind that presses against the back of your mind like a whisper too faint to catch. Lila had fallen asleep on the worn sofa, curled up with a library book about the stars, and Maggie was sorting through the drawer where she kept important papers, looking for the heating bill. That's when she came across Lila's birth certificate again. She had seen it dozens of times before, but today something made her pause. The name at the top, Infant Female Grace County Hospital, was typed, not handwritten. Beneath it, the mother's name was listed as unknown. Maggie frowned. She remembered Emily Dawson, clearly remembered her frightened eyes, the pain in her voice, the way she'd gripped Maggie's hand as labor tore through her. Emily had whispered her daughter's name, Lila Grace, before slipping into unconsciousness. So why wasn't her name anywhere on this certificate? And more disturbing still, why was the attending physician listed not as Dr. Harris, who Maggie remembered being on shift that night, but as R. Hale, M.D. Maggie's hands trembled as she traced the letters. Richard Hale wasn't a doctor. He was a biotech executive. He had no reason being listed on a medical document. Her breath caught as realization began to take shape, slow and dreadful. She pulled the certificate closer, studied the embossed seal at the bottom. It looked authentic, but there was something sterile about it, too clean, too perfect, as if it had been printed, not processed. She flipped it over and saw nothing. No hospital barcode, no timestamp. That was wrong. Maggie had handled hundreds of patient documents during her janitorial shifts at the hospital. There were always at least 2 stamps, one for time of birth, one for verification. Lila's had neither. For days after that, Maggie couldn't shake the unease. She began asking quiet questions around the hospital, but the nurses who had been on shift that night were either transferred, retired, or oddly evasive. Records from that week were missing due to a system update, according to administration. Even Dr. Harris, when Maggie ran into him at the grocery store, seemed to grow uncomfortable the moment she brought up Lila's name. "You must be mistaken," he said before hurrying off. Maggie stood frozen between the canned soup and the cereal aisle, heart pounding. Something wasn't just wrong. Something had been erased. And whatever it was, it had everything to do with Lila. It began on an ordinary morning that shattered everything. Maggie was in the kitchen slicing apples for Lila's school lunch, the radio humming low when the knock came, not the hesitant tap of a neighbor, but the sharp, authoritative thud of someone who had every intention of being let in. She opened the door and froze. Standing before her was Richard Hale, dressed in a crisp black suit, flanked by 2 men in sterile gray uniforms. His smile was polite, rehearsed, but his eyes were cold, clinical. "Ms. Turner?" he said, voice calm and calculated. "I believe you're in possession of a child that belongs to Hale Biogenics." The knife slipped from Maggie's hand and clattered to the floor. "She's not property," she whispered. "Her name is Lila Grace." Richard stepped inside without waiting for permission, surveying the home like an appraiser eyeing damaged goods. Her legal designation, he continued, pulling a folder from his briefcase, is Subject A9271. The child was the result of a classified genetic trial that unfortunately proceeded under less than ideal oversight. Your custodial involvement, while noted, is both unofficial and unauthorized. Maggie's knees went weak. She's a child, not a science project. Richard didn't flinch. She is a breakthrough. Our first successful neural mapped hybrid. Her genetic profile alone has already revolutionized 3 product pipelines. With her recent IQ metrics and cognitive acceleration, she is essential to our continued research. It's time she returns to where she belongs. She belongs with me, Maggie said, breath-trembling voice rising. She belongs in a home with books and sunlight and someone who loves her. Richard's smile tightened. "You misunderstand. This isn't an adoption case, Ms. Turner. It's a retrieval. Hale Biogenics owns the intellectual and biological property. I'm simply here to reclaim it." Maggie felt her chest tighten. Lila, who had been quietly standing behind the hallway door, now stepped forward, eyes wide, clutching the fabric doll Maggie had sewn years ago. "What's going on?" she asked softly. Maggie turned to her, forcing calm into her voice. "Nothing, sweetheart. Just someone who doesn't understand what family means." Richard's expression shifted from cordial to chilling. "I will return in 72 hours with legal documentation and security personnel. I suggest you prepare the child." And just like that, he left. The air was thick with the scent of fear and boiled apples. Maggie fell to her knees, held Lila close, and whispered, "Over my dead body." The moment Richard Hale walked out that door, leaving behind the icy declaration that Lila was corporate property, Maggie felt the walls of her quiet world begin to collapse. Her hands trembled as she clutched the old filing box she kept in the back of her bedroom closet, the one she hadn't opened in years, not since the hospital, not since the night she promised Emily she would watch over the baby no one else wanted. She yanked it down, papers spilling onto the floor, hospital wristbands, a lock of Lila's baby hair tied with blue thread immunization records she had filled out by hand, and finally, the birth certificate. At first glance, it looked official enough. Lila Grace Turner, born at Elk River Community Hospital, mother, listed as unknown with Maggie, marked as guardian. But now, staring at it with Richard's words ringing in her ears, Maggie noticed what she hadn't wanted to see before. The document had no state seal. The font on the header was slightly off. The registrar's name, Janet Brewer, was a nurse Maggie vaguely remembered from night shift who had since moved away. Maggie's heart pounded as she flipped the paper over. Nothing on the back. No official stamp. It was a forgery. A carefully crafted lie built to shield a child from the machinery that birthed her. Maggie sat back against the closet wall, hands on her lap, the weight of the truth pressing down on her chest. She remembered the night Lila was born, how Emily had clutched her hand, the faint sound of machines humming in the background, the absence of any attending doctor except for that young resident who disappeared the next day. She remembered how the baby had been marked for further evaluation and how she, Maggie, had taken her in under the radar, hoping no one would notice a janitor walking out with a bundle of blankets after a power outage. And now it all came back like a flood. The whispered conversations, the way Hale Biogenics had a wing inside the hospital, that most staff avoided the donations they made to keep things quiet. Lila didn't exist in the official system. She had no legal identity. Maggie had protected her with a web of makeshift records, borrowed names, and blind hope. But now faced with a billion-dollar corporation wielding legal firepower and hidden labs that Hope felt as thin as the paper in her hands, she realized with brutal clarity they weren't just coming for Lila. They had every legal loophole to take her. Unless Maggie did something unthinkable. It happened just past dawn, when the sun had barely crested the hills beyond Elk River and the birds were still too groggy to sing. Maggie had barely slept. She was still sitting at the kitchen table, a half-drunk cup of coffee gone cold, Lila's favorite scarf clutched in her lap. The knock on the door was heavy and deliberate, 3 firm raps that made her blood run cold. Before she could stand, the door swung open. 2 officers stepped inside, flanking Richard Hale, who entered with the self-assured arrogance of a man who had already won. "Ms. Turner," one officer said stiffly, "we're here on behalf of Hale Biogenics. There's a lawful order for the custody transfer of the minor known as Lila Grace." Maggie stood, voice trembling. "She's my daughter. She has been for 6 years. Richard didn't even look at her. She was never yours. She's company property. You've been harboring a genetically modified subject of an active research initiative. She's a child, not a test tube," Maggie snapped, voice cracking. Lila appeared at the hallway's edge, rubbing her eyes confused. "Mom." That single word cut through the room like a blade. One of the officers moved forward. "We don't want to cause a scene. Please let the girl come peacefully." Maggie dropped to her knees and opened her arms, whispering to Lila to stay calm, to trust her that she'd fix this. But Lila, already sensing the fear, backed away. "Why are they here? What did I do?" Maggie didn't know how to answer. Richard pulled out a manila folder, flashing what looked like official documentation orders, signed by a judge whose name Maggie didn't recognize. It all felt too fast, too rehearsed, like a play they'd already staged in some back room. The officers gently but firmly took Lila by the shoulders. She screamed. Maggie lunged, but one officer blocked her path. "Ma'am, don't make this harder." The last thing Maggie saw was Lila's terrified face pressed against the back window of a black SUV as it pulled away. Her cries echoed through the street, a sound too raw for dawn. Maggie stood frozen in the doorway, the scarf still clenched in her hands. She had protected Lila from shadows and secrets for 6 years, but now in broad daylight, the system had come for her. And it had won, at least for now. The letter arrived in a plain manila envelope with no return address, postmarked from somewhere in Montana. Maggie almost threw it out with the junk mail. She had been numb since Lila was taken, functioning on autopilot, barely registering the world outside her grief, but something about the scrawl of her name on the front stopped her. When she opened it, her hands began to shake. Inside was a notarized document and a short letter written in the familiar spidery handwriting of Dr. Samuel Rhodes, the quiet but kind-hearted physician who had once worked in the maternity wing of Elk River Hospital before retiring abruptly 3 years ago. She hadn't heard from him since. The letter was dated 6 weeks before his death and began with a somber confession. "Maggie, if you're reading this, I've already passed. There are things I should have said long ago, things I should have stopped. But I was afraid of the Hale family, afraid of what I'd lose. I can't carry that silence into death. What followed stunned her. Samuel had known. He had been there the night Lila was born, and he had witnessed Richard Hale's coercion, the forged consent forms, the transfer of Lila's records into the company's private database. He had even signed off on the birth certificate under duress, he admitted, but he'd secretly saved a true version, hidden it in a safety deposit box, and now he was transferring ownership of that box to Maggie through his will. I saw you that night, he wrote, sitting beside Emily, holding her hand when no one else dared. You were the only one in that hospital who treated that girl like a human being. And you were the only one who treated Lila like a child, not a specimen. I was too much of a coward to help you then. I'm trying at least now to do right by her. Maggie could barely breathe as she read. The notarized will attach, declared Maggie Turner, the legal guardian of Lila Grace Dawson, citing an enclosed affidavit from Emily before she fell into the coma, naming Maggie as the woman she trusted to raise her daughter if she could not. This wasn't just a letter. It was a lifeline, a legal crack in the monolith of Hale Biogenics. It was the first sliver of hope she had felt since Lila's screams had vanished down her street. And it would become the first page of Maggie's fight, not just to get Lila back, but to expose everything they had tried to bury. Tucked within the folds of Dr. Samuel Rhodes' final letter was another document, smaller and more clinical, but no less explosive. It was an official DNA test bearing the seal of a private genetics lab unaffiliated with Hale Biogenics. Rhodes had clearly gone out of his way to ensure the evidence could not be discredited or tied back to the company's far-reaching influence. Maggie unfolded it slowly, her eyes scanning the dense medical terminology, her heart pounding like a war drum in her chest. The names were clear: Emily Dawson, biological mother; Lila Grace Dawson, biological daughter. The results were unequivocal, a 99.998% probability of maternity. There it was in black and white, stripped of lies and tampered files. Lila was not an experimental hybrid. She was not a synthetic creation or a genetic anomaly. She was a child, Emily's child. A living, breathing human being stolen under the pretense of scientific advancement and corporate ownership. Maggie's hands trembled as she realized the magnitude of what she held. For 6 years, Richard Hale and his network had spun a web of deception, rewriting Lila's existence as a research asset, convincing everyone, including courts and regulators, that she was born with irreparable genetic abnormalities, her body an unfortunate byproduct of failed prenatal development. They had used that lie to justify taking her, hiding her away in the sterile chambers of Hale Biogenics' private facility, branding her with a research number, and denying her even the most basic human rights. But this report shattered that lie at its foundation. It meant everything they had done was not just morally reprehensible, it was illegal. It was kidnapping under the veil of science, trafficking under the name of innovation. And now Maggie had proof. Hard proof. Samuel had attached a signed affidavit from the lab director as well, confirming the integrity of the sample chain, preempting any challenge the Hale legal team might concoct. Maggie pressed the pages to her chest, tears brimming in her eyes, not just from hope, but from fury. All those nights she'd watched Lila sleep, wondering if the world would ever recognize her as real, as someone worth loving, protecting, fighting for. And now, the truth was in her hands. Not just a mother's instinct or a janitor's gut feeling, but irrefutable science. Emily had never abandoned her child. Her signature had been forged, her voice silenced, her body discarded. And Lila, that brilliant girl with eyes full of starlight, had been born not as an anomaly, but as a miracle. Maggie would not let the world forget that again. Maggie sat at the edge of her kitchen table, the late afternoon sun casting fractured light across the worn wooden surface, where stacks of documents lay spread like a battle map. Dr. Rhodes's letter, the DNA report, the affidavit from the geneticist, all pieces of a puzzle that pointed to one undeniable truth: a child had been stolen. And now it was time to fight back. Her fingers hovered over the rotary dial of the landline phone she rarely used, heart pounding with a mixture of fear and determination. After a moment's hesitation, she turned the dial and called the only lawyer in town she trusted, Daniel Whitaker, a seasoned civil rights attorney with a reputation for taking on impossible cases when no one else would. He had once represented families evicted by Hale's developments, and one barely before Hale Biogenics expanded into research. When he answered, Maggie's voice was steadier than she expected. She told him everything, sparing no detail. Emily's forced signature, Lila's abduction under the guise of research, the falsified birth records, and the newly uncovered DNA results proving Lila was Emily's biological child. Daniel was silent at first, then asked to see the documents. By nightfall, he was sitting across from her at that same kitchen table, his expression hardening with every page he read. "This is enough to open a civil suit, possibly even criminal charges," he murmured, glancing up at Maggie. "But it won't be easy. They'll fight. They'll smear you. They'll bury us in motions." "Are you sure you want to do this?" Maggie didn't hesitate. "I've watched that girl grow up. I taught her how to hold a spoon, how to spell her name. I'll go through hell before I let them take her again." That night, Daniel began drafting the petition requesting emergency custody review, initiating a motion to unseal Emily's original hospital records, demanding an investigation into Hale Biogenics' experimental research practices, and filing a motion for immediate injunctive relief to prevent further experimentation on Lila while the case was pending. Maggie provided every journal entry, every memory, every odd interaction she'd ever had with hospital staff surrounding Emily's disappearance and Lila's reclassification. Together, they built the beginnings of a legal case that could expose not only Hale's lies, but the systemic cracks that allowed it all to happen unchecked. Maggie didn't sleep that night. She watched the sun rise with swollen eyes and a steel spine. The world had stolen Lila in silence. Maggie intended to get her back loudly, legally, and without mercy. When Richard Hale received notice of the impending legal action against Hale Biogenics, he didn't flinch, he retaliated. With decades of experience shielding his empire from public scrutiny, lawsuits, and whistleblowers, he moved swiftly, pulling every string available to ensure the case would never see daylight. The morning after Maggie's filing, Richard sat in his Manhattan penthouse office, floor-to-ceiling windows, framing the city he had long since learned to manipulate. He made a single call to Lawrence Crane, a legendary corporate litigator whose name sent shivers through federal courtrooms, known for dismantling class action suits before they reached a judge's bench, for burying truth under mountains of paperwork, and for spinning corporate malfeasance into misunderstood innovation. Crane was as cold-blooded as he was effective. By afternoon, Crane had cleared his schedule. Within hours, a legal war room was established on the 48th floor of the Hale corporate tower, staffed with junior associates from the most cutthroat firms on the East Coast. Their mission: discredit Maggie Turner, erase Emily Dawson from public sympathy, seal every research record tied to Lila's name, and crush the local council's efforts with delays, technicalities, and jurisdictional acrobatics. Richard handed Crane a thick manila envelope labeled Turner File Background Checks Hospital Footage, old employment reviews, anything that could be spun into doubt or disgrace. "Make her look unstable," he said, voice flat, like she kidnapped a child she couldn't have, like this is all a sad delusion. Crane nodded without emotion. "We'll turn the courtroom into a coffin, quiet and final." Over the next few days, subpoenas rained down like bullets. Daniel Whitaker received notice after notice challenging his right to represent the case, questioning the authenticity of the DNA documents, even suggesting Maggie had tampered with medical files. Maggie's name appeared in leaked blog posts and gossip forums, accused of hoarding a stolen child, accused of paranoia, accused of grief-induced delusion. It was a smear campaign executed with surgical precision. But Richard didn't care about the truth-only ownership. To him, Lila wasn't a child. She was data, a patent in pigtails, and he would fight like hell to keep her locked behind the glass walls of Hale Biogenics, no matter the cost. On the morning of the preliminary hearing, the courthouse steps buzzed with reporters and murmurs of corporate scandal. Their cameras angled toward the entrance, where a frail but resolute woman emerged from a cab, clutching a worn cardboard box against her chest. Maggie Turner wore her plain gray coat, one size too large, buttoned up to the collar as if bracing herself, not only against the cold, but against the invisible war being waged around her. Beside her stood a young man in a modest suit, his tie slightly askew, his eyes sharp with determination, and just a trace of fear. Daniel Whitaker, the local attorney who had believed her when no one else would. They made an odd pair, the aging janitor with silver hair pinned in a bun, and the idealistic small-town lawyer barely 5 years out of law school, facing off against the most powerful biotech firm in the state. But what Maggie carried in that humble box spoke louder than any affidavit. Inside were 6 hand-stitched rag dolls, each with mismatched button eyes, fraying yarn hair, and initials sewn carefully onto faded fabric hearts. They were Lila's, each one made during long winter nights under soft lamplight when Maggie would watch the little girl sort books by color or whisper bedtime stories to her stuffed animals. They were more than toys, they were testimony, tangible proof of love, presence, time, evidence that this child had not been abandoned, not manufactured in a lab, not a specimen to be reclaimed, but a human being, raised in warmth and silence and sacrifice. As they entered the courtroom, Maggie kept the box close like armor. Daniel placed a gentle hand on her elbow. "We don't have their money, but we have the truth," he whispered. Maggie didn't answer. She looked ahead toward the doors where a team of expensive lawyers in tailored suits stood waiting like wolves in silk. She knew this fight wouldn't be fair. But when she looked down at the box in her arms and thought of Lila's giggle of tiny hands braiding thread of the first time that quiet child whispered "Mama," she knew this fight would be worth it. The courtroom had been a quiet storm of legal jargon and technical exhibits, corporate filings and genetic data, but none of it seemed to matter when Maggie Turner slowly stood from the witness bench. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached into the box of handmade dolls and pulled out the smallest one, the very first she had sewn when Lila was barely a week old, stitched from a worn hospital pillowcase, and 2 buttons she'd found in the laundry bin. The room hushed, even the judge leaning forward slightly. "Your Honor." Maggie began, her voice quivering not from fear but from the unbearable weight of truth, finally allowed to speak. "I did not give birth to Lila Grace. That is a fact, and I will not pretend otherwise. But facts alone don't tell you who a mother is." She held up the doll, her eyes locking with Richard Hale's from across the room. "I was the one who held her when her lungs were too weak to cry. I was the one who fed her through a tube when she couldn't swallow, who sang to her at night, even when I didn't know if she could hear me. I've sat through her fevers, her questions, her silences. I've read every book to her twice, waited outside every pediatric scan with my heart in my throat. I was there the first time she said, 'Mama,' and I knew she meant me." Her voice grew steadier, louder. "I didn't give her life, but I gave her a home. I didn't create her, but I stayed. Through every breath, every diagnosis, every storm. I was the one who stayed." She turned to the judge now, her eyes wet but unflinching. "I may not have biology on my side, but love isn't a science. It's presence. It's sacrifice. It's choosing someone again and again when it would be easier to walk away." Her voice broke only once, but it shattered the silence. "I didn't give birth to Lila Grace," she said again, almost whispering, "but I am the only one in her life who has never left her." A pause so thick you could feel it. Then stillness. In that moment, Maggie Turner wasn't just a janitor with a box of dolls. She was a mother, and everyone in that courtroom knew it. Just as the courtroom settled from the weight of Maggie's declaration, she reached into her worn leather satchel and pulled out 2 folders, one sealed, the other bulging with printed transcripts and a small flash drive taped to the inside. Her hands no longer trembled. This wasn't emotion anymore. It was evidence. "Your Honor," she said firmly, her voice now anchored by something colder than grief conviction. "With your permission, I'd like to submit into evidence 2 items that speak directly to the truth Mr. Hale has repeatedly concealed under the guise of corporate authority." She handed the documents to the bailiff, her eyes never leaving Richard Hale's. "This," she continued, holding up the first folder, "is a certified DNA test conducted by Dr. Samuel Rhodes prior to his passing. It clearly states that Lila Grace Dawson is the biological daughter of Emily Dawson. She is not a genetically engineered anomaly or the subject of any artificial gestation program, as Mr. Hale has implied. She was born naturally to a human mother, Emily Dawson, who was unconscious and unable to consent when her child was taken." The courtroom grew still. The second, Maggie said, now lifting the flash drive between her fingers, is an audio recording obtained on hospital premises 6 years ago. In it, Mr. Hale is heard instructing staff to remove the name Lila Grace from all internal documentation and replace it with experimental asset identifier HBG2197. When asked why, he states, and I quote, "She's better off as a line item. No mother, no birth certificate, no liability." A murmur rippled through the courtroom as the recording was cued for playback. "This isn't just corporate overreach," Maggie said softly but fiercely. "It's the erasure of a child's identity for profit." Her eyes scanned the room, slowly landing once more on the judge. He didn't just lie. He rewrote a life. And as the first crackling lines of Richard's own voice echoed from the speakers, cold, clinical, undeniable, the air in the courtroom changed. Truth, long buried under paperwork and power, had finally found its voice. Emily opened her eyes to the pale white of a hospital ceiling, the kind of sterile light that seemed to erase all sense of time, of identity, of past. For several seconds, she stared blankly, her mind struggling to attach meaning to the sounds and shapes around her. The steady beep of a monitor, the soft hum of a machine, the rhythmic rise and fall of her own breath, all of it felt unfamiliar, like waking up inside someone else's life. When a nurse entered the room and greeted her by name, "Emily, welcome back," she blinked, confused. The name floated in the air like a word she recognized but couldn't fully claim. "Emily," she repeated under her breath, tasting it like something distant and uncertain. Panic didn't arrive all at once. It unfolded in small, creeping moments, the absence of memory, not of facts, but of feeling. She could recall the color blue, the texture of hospital sheets, the scent of antiseptic, but not who she had last spoken to, or what day it was, or why her stomach felt like something had been taken from it. Her hands instinctively drifted toward her abdomen, sensing a void she couldn't name. "Did I have a baby?" she asked the nurse. Her voice brittle, terrified of the answer. The nurse hesitated, then gave a rehearsed, careful nod. "Yes, you gave birth. There were some complications. You've been unconscious for some time." But that word birth rattled in Emily's mind like a locked door she couldn't open. She couldn't picture the baby, couldn't hear a cry, couldn't remember a name. The nurse offered comforting words, but they washed over her like rain on glass. Someone had said the baby was safe. But what did that mean? Where was she now? Who had held her first? Emily's heartbeat raced as fragments tried to rearrange themselves. Flashes of a woman's voice, someone warm, someone saying, "You're not alone." But the faces were smeared, the edges blurred, and her own reflection in the mirror was a stranger's. She didn't know what had been stolen yet, but she could feel the empty space where something once lived, something real, something she hadn't chosen to forget. It wasn't the nurses or the photographs or the sterile medical charts that brought her back. It was the sound of a child's voice and the worn edges of a hand-sewn doll resting gently beside her hospital bed. Emily had been sitting up in silence, her hands tracing invisible patterns across the blanket, when the door creaked open, and a small figure stepped cautiously inside. The girl couldn't have been more than 6. Her hair was soft and wild, her eyes impossibly deep, holding a hesitation that didn't quite match her age. She clutched a cloth doll with one arm, its seams uneven, and smile crooked, clearly homemade, clearly loved. The moment Lila's voice floated into the room, small and almost whispering, "Hi. Are you feeling better?" something inside. Emily cracked. Not in pain, but in recognition. The timbre of that voice, the softness of it, the way the child lingered in the doorway as if unsure whether she was allowed to belong, something about that voice unlocked a door that had refused to budge. Emily blinked, and the haze in her mind began to lift, not in clear snapshots, but in waves, flickers of pain and sweat and tears. A name whispered in the dark, a lullaby she once sang without fully knowing why. Her eyes drifted to the doll in Lila's arms. The fabric, the stitching, red thread on cotton skin. And suddenly, she remembered. She remembered holding a tiny bundle in the crook of her arm, whispering Lila Grace through the fog of exhaustion. She remembered a pair of hands, Maggie's hands, offering the doll, placing it beside her baby, as if offering her a companion for the journey. The name, the touch, the voice. They all came rushing back like light through a cracked door. Emily's breath caught her lips parting without sound, and then her voice, fragile but certain, broke through. Lila. The girl nodded slowly, her eyes welling. Emily's hands trembled as she reached out. There, in that silent collision of memory and presence, the chasm of lost time began to heal. The courtroom was silent as the judge's voice cut through the tension, with deliberate precision, each word striking like a gavel against glass. After weeks of testimonies, forensic documents, character witnesses, and evidence that laid bare the shadows behind Hale Biotech's polished walls, the final verdict rang clear and irreversible. Richard Hale was found guilty on multiple counts of fraud, falsification of legal identity, and violation of national bioethics protocols. The court had reviewed the evidence meticulously: the forged birth records, the genetic research files stripped of consent, the audio recording in which Richard had referred to a living, breathing child as merely a research asset, identified only by a serial number. It was not just a matter of corporate misconduct. It was an indictment of a man who had knowingly erased a child's identity to protect his company's intellectual property. The judge spoke of the profound breach of trust, the inhumane classification of Lila as non-human material, the exploitation of a comatose mother and an elderly caregiver, and the manipulation of scientific systems for personal gain. Richard's legal team sat rigid and expressionless, their earlier confidence eroded by the sheer weight of undeniable facts. Across the room, Maggie squeezed Emily's hand as the judge continued, citing specific legal codes, violated most damningly the unauthorized genetic documentation and the covert transfer of Lila to a private lab without guardianship review. The court emphasized that science without conscience was not progress but peril. Richard's sentence would be determined in the following weeks, but the ruling was already historic. Not only was his reputation dismantled, but Hale Biotech was placed under federal investigation, its licenses temporarily suspended pending ethical review. The ruling concluded not just a case, but a war over identity, dignity, and what it means to be human. And in that moment, when Richard's eyes finally lifted toward the family he tried to erase, he saw not defeat, but the irreversible truth that no child, no matter how exceptional or inconvenient, could be reduced to a barcode. When the final ruling was handed down and the courtroom began to empty, there was a stillness that seemed to suspend time itself, as if the weight of everything that had transpired needed a quiet moment to settle. Then came the words that Maggie had barely dared to hope for, the ones Emily had clung to in the fog of her returning memories, and the ones Lila had yearned for, without fully understanding why the court hereby grants joint legal guardianship of Lila Grace to Maggie Whitmore and Emily Lang. The statement was clear, final, and restorative. Lila was no longer a case number, no longer a line in a research file, no longer a stolen child. She was a daughter, loved, protected, and finally legally home. Maggie didn't cry right away. She just stood there, frozen, hand over her mouth, as if the dam of 6 long years had cracked but hadn't yet burst. Emily reached for her eyes, already welling, and Lila, not fully comprehending the formality of it all, ran forward and wrapped her arms around both women. Her voice, soft but certain, simply said, "Can we go home now?" The judge smiled faintly, not out of sentimentality but recognition that this child, caught in the cold machinery of ambition and deception, had found something stronger than law or science, a family built on presence, not perfection. Later that day, in the quiet warmth of their small kitchen, Maggie set 2 plates on the table while Emily poured milk into a chipped glass, and Lila sat between them, cradling the same cloth doll Maggie had sewn years ago. The papers were signed. The system had spoken. But what truly mattered was unspoken: the rituals of bedtime stories, shared glances over breakfast, a hand held tightly in a moment of fear. For all the forces that had tried to separate them, money, power, institutions, it was love, quiet and stubborn, that brought them back together. And from that day forward, every school form, medical record, and future milestone would bear one unshakable truth: Lila Grace belonged to them, and they to her. Not by blood alone, but by every choice to stay. 1 year later, the farmhouse stood quietly beneath a canopy of spring blossoms, its weathered white panels catching the light, like old paper touched by sunlight. Inside, the rhythms of life had settled into something sacred, unremarkable to the outside eye perhaps, but deeply miraculous to the three souls within. Maggie rose first, always before dawn, her hands as steady as ever, while tending to the hens and chopping kindling her boots, creaking softly against the dewy earth. Emily followed not long after, her movements slower but no less deliberate, carrying coffee in mismatched mugs and humming to herself as if reclaiming pieces of a voice lost long ago. And then there was Lila, now 7, hair perpetually unbrushed and eyes filled with quiet fire, often found sprawled on the living room floor, surrounded by books far too advanced for her age, or tucked into the corner of the barn with a sketch pad full of strange, beautiful shapes. They had built a life that was neither loud nor large, but full of moments that stitched themselves gently into memory. Maggie kneeling to mend a tear in Lila's jeans, Emily reading aloud from old philosophy texts, while Lila built circuits out of discarded radios, the three of them hanging laundry in the sun, while chickens pecked idly at their feet. The farm was small, humble, and not always easy to maintain, but it belonged to them, bought with money pooled from Maggie's savings, and a quiet legal settlement that Emily never talked about. The land held no ghosts, now only stories, and the silence between the three was no longer the silence of fear or shame, but of comfort, each knowing the other was near. Lila still bore the scars of her strange beginning, occasional fevers, inexplicable dreams, moments where her mind seemed to move faster than her body could follow, but she was safe, anchored by the two women who had in their own ways refused to let her become an experiment or a ghost. At night, when the wind moved through the fields like breath through lungs, Emily would sit at the window with a cup of tea, watching Maggie repair an old gate by lantern light, while Lila fell asleep hugging the same cloth doll stitched years ago. They didn't call themselves a miracle. They didn't have to. They were simply finally a family. They named it Lila's Porch, not after grandeur or legacy, but after the quiet place where it all began, the rickety wooden steps where Lila once sat for hours with her cloth doll staring at the horizon like it held secrets only she could decode. What started as an idea whispered between Maggie and Emily in the kitchen over chipped mugs and sleepless nights slowly became real, a home, a sanctuary, a lifeline for children like Lila, the forgotten, the misunderstood, the ones born with gene anomalies that made the world call them broken or dangerous or inconvenient. They began by converting the old barn into living quarters, painting the walls soft colors and sewing blankets by hand, filling the shelves with books, puzzles, instruments, anything that sparked curiosity. Word spread quietly through nurses who had seen too much, social workers tired of bureaucracy, even a janitor from a nearby clinic who left a note and a newborn on their porch with nothing but a file that read, "Jen Unclassified." Within months there were 5 children, then 8, then 12, each one different in ways that defied categories. A girl who could remember every word she ever read. A boy whose skin reacted violently to sunlight, but whose musical compositions stunned local professors. A toddler who didn't speak, but could replicate any machine sound after hearing it once. The state didn't know what to make of them, but Maggie filed the licenses, Emily fought through the legalese, and Lila read to them at night, her voice calm, otherworldly, always ending with the same phrase, "You are not a mistake. You are the answer to a question they haven't learned to ask yet." They built routines, gardening, painting, stargazing, and rules grounded not in punishment but protection. The porch lights stayed on all night just in case another child found their way there. And slowly, as bureaucrats looked the other way and medical experts began visiting under false names, Lila's Porch became more than a home. It became a quiet rebellion against a world that saw difference as defect. It became proof that science without love is empty, and that the ones deemed errors by the system might just be its only hope. It became most of all a place where no child would ever again be given a number instead of a name. The wooden sign appeared one morning just as the fog lifted off the fields, carved not by professionals, but by Maggie's own hands, each letter etched slowly, deliberately, with the same patience she once used to sew tiny buttons on Lila's first cloth doll. She didn't ask for permission or funding or approval. She simply took an old plank of wood from the shed, sanded it until it was smooth, and with trembling fingers wrote the words that had lived in her heart for years. Here you don't need to carry anyone's name. You only need to be loved. They mounted it on 2 wooden posts near the edge of the gravel driveway, right before the mailbox where every child would see it as they arrived, sometimes alone, sometimes with nothing but a plastic bag and questions no one had answered. The words didn't offer legal guarantees or medical diagnoses or salvation, but they were the purest promise Maggie, Emily, and Lila could offer, that this place would never demand you prove your worth through pedigree or bloodline. Never ask for a last name to assign your value, never turn you away for being too complicated, too different, too much. The sign became more than a message. It became the soul of Lila's porch. Children would touch it as they passed, some pressing their palms flat against the wood, like it could anchor them, others whispering the words aloud to themselves like a prayer. There were no uniforms here, no strict labels, no locked doors, only schedules built around curiosity, shared meals made from scratch, and a daily ritual where each child, no matter their age or ability, was asked, "What do you want to learn today?" For some, the answer was math. For others, music. And for many, the answer was silence, until they were ready. The sign stood in rain and sun, its edges weathered, but its message unwavering. One night during a thunderstorm, a runaway boy arrived, soaked and shivering, drawn by the porch light, and those simple words carved into the dark. He didn't know his last name. He didn't know who had left him at birth. But when Maggie wrapped him in a blanket, when Lila offered her old doll, when Emily whispered, "You're home now," the sign had already done its job. It had told the truth that every child deserves to hear. You do not have to carry someone else's story to be worthy of love. You are enough exactly as you are. In a world that often defines us by our last names, our bloodlines, or the checkboxes on a form. Lila's porch reminds us of something quietly radical, that love, not lineage, is what makes us belong. Maggie wasn't Lila's biological mother. Emily, for a time, wasn't conscious of her own child. And Lila, with all her genetic anomalies and brilliance, wasn't what the world expected. But still together they formed a family stronger than any legal document or DNA strand could define. This story challenges us to rethink what it means to be someone's child or someone's parent. Sometimes the truest families are the ones we choose, the ones who show up, and the ones who stay. In real life, we may not open a home like Lila's porch, but we can each create spaces, emotional, physical, even digital, where people feel seen and safe. You don't need a license to listen. You don't need credentials to care. Every act of presence, of quiet support, of telling someone you are enough can be life-changing. And if you've ever felt like you didn't belong because of your past, your name, your appearance, or your silence, remember this. The most beautiful places in the world are often built by those who were once made to feel like misfits. You can be that place for someone else. So if this story touched you, taught you something, or simply made you pause, leave a comment below and tell us, what does family mean to you? Save this video so you can return to it when the world feels cold. And if you believe more stories like this need to be told, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Your voice, your presence, and your kindness might just be the porch someone else has been waiting for.